Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's special episode of What's at Stake, celebrating the publication of Josie Cox's new book, Women, Money, Power. I'm your host today, Andy Whitehouse, partner here at Penta in New York, joined by my dear friend Josie to discuss her process and insights from her account of the fight for female equality. The book describes how women have fought for financial freedom and details the social and political hurdles that have kept them from equality. Josie is an editor, a journalist, and a broadcaster with a particular interest in business, power, workplace culture, and gender. Next week, Pentonworth Media will host a launch party for Josie's book. The event will feature a conversation on the book's fascinating narrative account of progress, women's lives, and the work still to be done for women's empowerment. Thank you, Josie, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Andy.
So, Josie, let's maybe start with a bit of background on how the book came about. What inspired you to write Women, Money, Power, and what were some of the things you came across in the process of developing the concept for the book?
Yeah. So I always say that the book took about 3 years to write, from when I started researching to all the way through to publication just now. But the reality of it is that the idea for the book was probably percolating for, the best part of the last 10 years. I have been a journalist for about 15 years. I started my career at Reuters and then the Wall Street Journal, writing about financial markets, stock markets, bond markets, currencies, things like that. And one of the things that I always noticed about my reporting and about the sort of spaces in which I was moving as I was doing my reporting was that they were still so male dominated. And of course, money and finance and banking being sort of the epicenters of power in our economies, I always thought that was problematic, that we still, despite all the effort and all of the hard work that so many of us have been doing for such a long time over the past decades, there's still such a stark inequality in the money space, so to speak. And so I've always wanted to write the book. I had been working in Europe for the bulk of my career. I relocated to America during the pandemic in March 2020 and just realized that the history of inequality in this country is so rich and so troubling and still so evident in so many ways. And so I just thought that this was a wonderful opportunity to delve into that at a really, really critical time, I think, and at a time of reckoning as well for this country and for, the systems by which we all live and work.
So maybe before we talk about sort of where things stand today, I think it's important to note that this is a work of history. And so maybe you could take us back, Josie, to sort of the beginning of the story, where the book begins and sort of how you framed up and lay out the sort of the beginning of your historical narrative.
Yeah. And I should say probably that the actual trigger for writing the book and deciding that it should be a sort of chronological history was a conversation that I had at the height of the pandemic with a individual who is a very, very powerful business leader. And I spoke to him off the record and I asked him about his views on the gender pay gap and why it's still so pervasive, why, here in America, women on average still only make 82 cents for every dollar earned by their male counterpart. And the answer that he gave me really floored me. He said that what I had to understand was that sometimes when a woman decides to start a family, when she takes a temporary leave from the paid labor market, when she comes back, she's just not as professionally ambitious as she was before. And it really surprised me that despite the complexity of this topic, despite the fact that this individual is so highly educated and has such an amazing acumen for business, that was the most obvious and the most appropriate answer that he deemed to this particular question. And so I thought the only way of writing about this is to go back in history and to see where we came from and how we evolved in order to understand why we are where we are today. And so that was sort of a preamble answer to your question. So what I decided to do was to go all the way back to the Second World War. And I chose that time because that was a time when women in large numbers came into the paid labor market out of necessity, really, for the first time. And so it was the first time that women were making their own money, that women understood and learnt firsthand that they were just as capable of working in pretty much any profession that had previously been dominated by men. And then subsequently, when the war was over, they were essentially overnight moved back into what I call the unpaid labor market, which is the home. And they defaulted back to this caregiver role. And I think that sort of inflection point was really, really important for our understanding of how subsequent generations of women approached labor, approached the economy, approached their own financial opportunities. And so that's sort of the opening of the book is the Second World War. I found a lady who is still alive today. She's 97 years old, and I spent a good amount of time with her. She actually built aircraft at Boeing during the Second World War when she was a teenager, and she now lives in Pennsylvania, and she reflects very, with a lot of mixed emotions on that time. But I think that her story is so important when we talk about this narrative of female economic empowerment and where we all came from. And so, after the Second World War, we sort of enter the period of the 50s and the 60s, and the 60s being such a pivotal moment because that was the time when the contraceptive pill became available for the first time. It was approved by the FDA here in the US in 1960. And unequivocally, the access to birth control and reproductive rights are absolutely unequivocally linked to financial independence and freedom. And so one of the chapters dwells on that particular moment in history and why it was so important. And the rest of the book moves through the decades all the way up to the present day, aiming to really answer this question of why, despite all of these pioneers of women's rights and fighters for economic empowerment, why are we still where we are today?
Can you tell me just some more of those stories about the sort of the World War II pioneers that you found? I'd love to hear just a little the backstory of how you were able to track them down, and then some of the lessons that we can take away from the stories that they told you.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, I decided that this book had to be a work of narrative nonfiction. It had to be a book about individuals and about people. And wherever possible, I wanted to get those stories from, first person sources, primary sources. And I wanted to hear how it actually was for the people who actually went through that. And so my first port of call was archives. I looked through newspaper archives to try and determine whether, these women who worked during the Second World War were still alive, were still willing and able to tell their stories. And this one particular woman, May, who I came across, who lives in Pennsylvania and who I ended up becoming, getting to know really, really well over the course of reporting. She had done some interviews with local newspapers about being a Rosie the Riveter on, significant anniversaries and things like that. And I then tracked her down on social media on Facebook. She was spending a lot of time on Facebook during the pandemic. I reached out to her, and within a few hours, we were on the phone, and I visited her. I actually spoke to her this morning because she wanted an update on how everything was going in relation to the book. And I'm just amazed at how lucid she is, considering that she's 97 years old, and how driven and passionate she still is, how determined to tell her story and to get the recognition for these women who came into the paid labor market really for the first time and, essentially changed the course of history. It sounds like a grand statement, but I very much believe it's true. And just quickly in terms of some other characters who really stood out, there was one woman who I spent an inordinate amount of time researching, who actually was the lady who probably single-handedly funded most of the significant research and development into the contraceptive pill that became available in 1960. Her name is Catherine Dexter McCormick, and she, I often say she was written out of history, but it's probably more accurate to say that she was never written into history in the first place. And yet, so much of the way that women were able to stake out careers and stake out a place for themselves in the economy is thanks to the determination that Catherine Dexter McCormick had for allowing them to do that.
And tell me, Josie, did your thesis sort of shift through the course of, I suppose, particularly the last 3 years of the actual process of writing? If the narrative did change, how did it change, and were there any surprises sort of along the way, and as you were undertaking your research and sort of building out the structure of the story?
Definitely, yeah. So when I first set out to write the book, I really envisioned it being a trajectory, a narrative of progress. Here's where we were, here's where we are today. This is the linear trajectory that we have followed. And even though I anticipated that I would discover that that trajectory was sort of shaped by progress and then set back by ups and downs, I didn't quite appreciate how dramatic those were. And, even just in the course of my reporting, certain developments in this country, particularly, have caused huge setbacks to women's independence, the overturn of Roe v. Wade in 2022 being perhaps the prime example of that. But also, more sort of subtle things that I think we don't talk about enough. In the 1970s and 1980s, we had a huge amount of legislative change, really, really significant Supreme Court rulings on things like women not being able to get fired for getting pregnant, women not being able to be denied credit purely on account of their gender, things like that. Women getting business loans. Up until 1988, a woman had to have a male co-signer to get a business loan. And it was so extreme that there's one example in my book of a woman who actually had to she was a widow, and she actually had to get her teenage son to co-sign in order to get a business loan, which, if you think about it today, I mean, it's sort of ludicrous to deem her less creditworthy than her dependent teenage son. So a huge amount of progress. And then we hit the 90s. And I think the one thing that sort of seeps into the equation in a really obvious way is culture. The 90s were really characterized in American society as a time when media became really dominant. The number of people who had TVs increased rapidly. It was the dawn of the internet in the late 90s. And that sort of translated into a real culture of misogyny across mainstream media. We also, obviously, during that decade had things like the Anita Hill hearing, the Monica Lewinsky affair, all episodes that really demonstrated in a pretty crass way that it's societally acceptable to undermine the credibility of women and to normalize that. And to me, delving into all of those examples really demonstrated the extent to which the trajectory shifted and the direction of progress really, really took a sharp, hairpin turn in that decade, which is quite depressing.
I mean, it is depressing, but I know that you found sort of points of light and reasons to be cheerful as you were working through your research and writing the manuscript. So there's a lot here for us to work on. There's much for us to do as we seek to build a stronger, better society. But what points of encouragement and optimism can we draw from the book, from your research today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to retain perspective and to understand that despite all of these setbacks that I've talked about, we've come an awfully long way since the beginning of this book, since the 1940s. The law has certainly made huge strides. Up until 1993, marital rape wasn't outlawed in every single state. So considering that that was so recent, we have come a really, really long way. Women are also, very visible in leadership positions. There are more women who are at the top of Fortune 500 companies than ever before. It's still only 10%, but it's a dramatic increase from where we were even just 20 years ago. So, and I say in the book that one of our duties is to be hopeful and to be optimistic and not to give up hope for, this continuation of a trajectory of progress. And I also sort of touch on some of the areas where we can all kind of do our bit towards ensuring that the future does look more equitable. I think one of the big things that I touch on is that education is still very much lacking. It might feel like we've been talking about the gender pay gap for years and we've been talking about DEI initiatives for years. But I think, the anecdote I told you earlier about the business leader who said to me that the gender pay gap exists because women who become mothers are less ambitious at work. I think that just illustrates that the nuances of these gaps are really not understood at the highest echelons of business in the way that they should be. And I think, relating to that, I don't think business leaders actually fully understand the financial incentives either. The extent to which global GDPs could be bolstered if female labor force participation were equivalent to male labor force participation. And if we had those mechanisms in place, around childcare, around flexible working, whatever it might be, that could really be something that, offers financial benefits to everyone, regardless of gender. And then the other thing that I think, should be a source of hope is that I do think we're getting better at communicating. We still have an awfully long way to go. But I think that, in this world of extreme polarization, at a time that is extremely charged, I mean, as well as I do, how many huge national elections are happening in 2024. This is really a time of political change and political upheaval and uncertainty. But we can use communication as a force for good. We can use it as a way to establish common values, establish respect, to establish empathy, and to get people to understand the other side of the story, what it's like to stand in someone else's shoes. And ultimately, I hope that, my book contributes to that narrative and to that dialogue.
Thank you, Josie. Let's take a very quick break, and we'll be back to talk some more about women, money, power.
Penta is the world's first comprehensive stakeholder solutions firm. We are a one-stop shop for the intelligence and strategy leaders need to assess a company's reputation and make decisions that improve their positioning. As executives in the C-suite must account for a growing set of engaged stakeholders, all with distinct, fast-changing demands, Penta provides real-time intelligence and strategy solutions. We work with clients solving complex global challenges across a variety of industries. Our clients span technology, financial services, energy, healthcare, and more. To learn more about how Penta can support your company, check out our website at pentagroup.co, our Twitter at pentagrp, or find us on LinkedIn at Penta Group.
Welcome back to this week's special episode of What's at Stake, marking the publication of Josie's new book, Women, Money, Power. Thanks again, Josie, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's great.
So I wanted to ask a question about young women who are going to read the book and thinking about their careers. And so for aspiring female writers, like people like you, journalists, people interested in documentary film, in traditional business jobs in finance or professional services, what kind of advice would you have for them as they think about their professional lives, the way that the labor market is working today, based on what you've learned from the process of researching and writing the book, and how perhaps has the book sort of changed your mind about the way that gender equity concerns are addressed in the context of the labor market?
It's a good question. So the first thing I would say before answering the question is that, this book is literally got women in the title, Women, Money, Power, but that doesn't mean it is a book for women. It is a book, really for everybody. And from the outset, that was my goal. I wanted to write a book about the labor market, about gender, yes, but about equality predominantly and inequality. And so I would urge, I've told many people about the book, and a lot of business leaders who are male have said, great, I'll buy this for my wife. And I say, well, why don't you buy it for yourself? Or buy it for my daughter. And I'll say, well, maybe buy a copy for your son as well, because it really is a common effort. And, we're not going to move the needle if we continue to make inequality in the gender pay gap a woman's issue. That being said, speaking to women in the labor market, especially women who are coming into the labor market, having done all the research for the book, having read all the research, having done the interviews, having seen the statistics and the data, I would say that, I would really encourage them to have those conversations that are perhaps difficult and awkward, but to challenge things in a way that is rooted in respect. If you think that you are in a position where you are being undervalued economically, how might you have a conversation to acknowledge or address that in a respectful manner? I strongly believe in the power of effective communication. And I think generally most of us don't communicate enough. So having conversations understanding that we're all humans, voicing concerns, voicing frustrations, voicing anger or sadness or those emotions in the workplace, I think is totally okay. And also just considering the other perspective. I talked about this a minute ago, but understanding why something is the way it is and who might have come up with that and why they might not have had the full picture. And I'm thinking specifically around things like hybrid and flexible working. It's so topical after the pandemic. A lot of workplaces are having return to work in-person mandates now, but those don't work for everyone. And if you are, a parent who has caring responsibilities and you found that a hybrid schedule really enables you to reach your full personal and professional potential at the same time, then, if your manager is mandating you to come back into the office, rather than complain about it and say this is so unfair and resort to that sort of, reaction, why not sit down and explain the factors that are at play here? And that, if you were given the opportunity to continue working flexibly, why that would make you such more of a valuable asset to the firm. So just having those conversations and doing whatever you can not to entrench division and polarization even further in the workforce. And there's no blanket rule for everyone. Every individual is different and every organization is different. But I think that just having those conversations and sort of breaking the taboo around topics like that is really, really important. And then for organizations specifically and for businesses, I would say, ensuring that you really appreciate as a business this untapped opportunity of creating an environment in which gender equity is not a nice to have, and that sounds cliched, but like a real strategic priority. And we know all the data sort of academically and cognitively. I think we know all the data that having a more diverse team in which everyone can thrive regardless of their gender and background and whatever is just better for an organization at whole. We know all that. So let's make sure that we're actually implementing that and we're actually leveraging that knowledge and that understanding for our own benefit. So just education, discourse, debates, communication, but always making sure that everything is rooted in respect and in these common values and common interests.
Yeah, I love that. And obviously Penta's a communications firm. We obsess around here about intelligence and analytics around employees and consumers, political leaders, investors, and the like. And at the same time, think really hard about how it is that you have the right persuasive conversations. And so that obsession we have here around talent and human capital, the points you're making really resonate with me. I think companies have struggled a great deal to figure out how to manage the return to work. Yeah. Clearly, some have done much better than others and are benefiting competitively as a result. So yeah. It's in everybody's interest from a competitive basis as well as being fundamentally clearly the right thing for people to do.
Yeah, totally. And I think, what we can't underestimate is that through the COVID-19 pandemic, we really went through something extremely traumatic as a workforce, as an economy, as a society. And that shouldn't be forgotten and it shouldn't be underplayed. I saw some data recently around the remote working tax and how people who are still taking advantage of the opportunity to work remotely actually see themselves making less money on average than those people who are going back to being in person. And now that is probably, on account of biases, heuristics that play into decisions around promotion and pay. But I think it's really, really important to understand that, if someone chooses to work remotely, it doesn't mean that they're less committed. It doesn't mean that they're less of an asset to a particular team. It's probably because of circumstances that they're choosing to do this. So, I would really encourage managers who are making those decisions to see things for what they are and to have conversations and to, truly understand that individuals have been through an awful lot over the last 5 years and to respect that.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear to me that Women, Money, Power needs to be compulsory reading for managers from coast to coast.
I'm slightly biased, but I would tend to agree.
So maybe as we sort of wrap things up a little, Josie, tell me a bit about the writing process. I know this is you write every day, you're a prolific journalist and broadcaster, but this is your first full-length book, and the task of, I don't mean to downplay the sort of the task of everyday writing for your newsletter, for print media, for digital media, but obviously it's an immense task to put together a book like this. So what was the process like? What was surprising? What was interesting? What was frustrating about it? I'd love to hear just a little bit about the history of the history.
The history of the history. Well, I approached the task with an awful lot of respect because I knew, or I had an idea at least of how ambitious it was to write a book in this world where everyone seems to want to write a book and it's a very busy space. So, you really want to differentiate yourself. I was very fortunate in that I had some incredible mentors. When I actually started the process of putting together a proposal for the book, which is generally what you do with nonfiction books, I was actually on a fellowship at Columbia Journalism School. So I had some infrastructure in place and some guidance from, very established book writers. And one person in particular, Professor Sam Friedman, who runs a book seminar at Columbia Journalism School, was really instrumental in kind of giving me that first push and saying, yes, this is a good idea. You should dedicate the next few years of your life to doing this. And then, when I pulled together the proposal, when I sort of knew what I wanted to write about, I really, ironically, it's funny when I reflect on this, ironically, it was a lot of powerful men who helped me get this thing off the ground and make it a reality. Not that gender matters in this context, but I think it's important to note that they were on this journey with me. And, I think it's very illustrative of the fact that the debates that we have around gender and inequality should never be us versus them debates. We're all on the same side here. And I think that was sort of demonstrated beautifully in the fact that I had this team of people essentially who was, willing to put in the call, willing to refer me to someone, willing to give me advice, whatever it was. I was fortunate enough to find a great agent who believed in this project, and then subsequently a really great editor who had experience writing or editing books on social justice, on gender, and really understood what I was trying to do. He also was a person who pushed me to be ambitious in my reporting and to make this, truly a sweeping history of female economic empowerment in America. And for me, to go there as a writer, despite the fact that I had been in this country for about 5 minutes. But he, made the point that perhaps it was precisely that made me the right person for this, because I came to it with fresh eyes and I was able to look at it in a sort of critical way. The book writing, the research and the writing, every author does this differently. I like to write as I report and sort of start capturing words on page while I'm actually in the process of reporting. Other writers, other authors like to do all their reporting up front and then come away with stacks and stacks of notes and then somehow put it together into nice sentences. But I really put pen to paper the first day that I went out to report. And I'd say that whole process took about 18 months, 2 years almost. And then editing and getting feedback and having to maybe kill some parts of the book that I thought were brilliant. And with hindsight, it was probably the right decision to leave certain parts out. And that sort of brings us up to the present day and publication day.
So we're recording this together towards the end of February, but this pod will be hitting our audience's ears sometime around March 6th. And I think I'm right in thinking that the book will be out and in bookstores, physical, digital, and other by the time people are listening to this. So as a last question, Josie, what are you looking forward to most about the book now being out in the world, and what comes next in the process?
It's a good question. So yes, the book is out March 5th in the US and Canada, wherever you buy good books, and available across Europe from the 14th of March. And, I think I'm already seeing now some of the great things that are stemming from this project. There's one of the characters who I profile in the book was this amazing civil rights activist, Pauli Murray, who was one of the first people to really recognize the intersection of race and gender. And in the course of promoting the book and, posting about it on social media, one of her relatives got in touch with me. And I actually had a long conversation just this morning with this lady's niece, who is in her 80s herself and is really trying to, she's on the same journey as I am, in the sense that she's trying to elevate these women who have been written out or not even written into history and give them the recognition and the acknowledgement that they deserve. And so I really look forward to continue making those connections and seeing where the stories that I tell in my book take me and the introductions that it can make. So I think that will be really exciting. I do have ideas for other books I want to write in future. I think that, the work to elevate women through history who are not known is never done, unfortunately, because there are so many of them. And so, after maybe a few days of pause, I would really be ready and eager to throw myself into the next reporting project and to continue on this mission of elevating women and, exploring this really interesting intersection of women, money, and power.
Well, Josie, as I say, we at Penta are obsessed with questions and understanding the dynamics in the labor market, questions relating to talent, and thinking about how it is that the way we structure and organize our society leads to bad outcomes, to great outcomes, to social progress. So it's been just such a thrill having you come onto the podcast and tell us a little bit about the book. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
It's been fun. So to our regular listeners, thank you so much for listening to the conversation with Josie today. Please, as always, remember to like our content, subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow us on X at Penta Group and on LinkedIn at Penta Group. I am your host, Andy Whitehouse. And as always, thank you for listening to What's at Stake. We'll see you next time.